Welcome to the America250PA Start Here, America Did podcast, telling the unique stories that make up the diverse fabric of Pennsylvania.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Start Here, America Did podcast. I'm Cassandra Coleman, the Executive Director of America250PA, and I am so excited to introduce you to another episode in our series. Our podcast is dedicated to celebrating Pennsylvania, showcasing not only the Commonwealth's stories and achievements, but also paying homage to its past and the people and events that have laid the foundation for our modern day. Embracing this commitment to unearthing and honoring history, we have invited Historic Philadelphia, an organization devoted to authenticity and education, to present today's episode. Joining us are Keith Henley and Robert Branch, our distinguished reenactors for this episode. They will be bringing to life the stories of historical Pennsylvania figures who, despite being enslaved in other states, fought tirelessly for their freedom and ultimately contributed to the betterment of society. Keith Henley will embody Henry Box Brown, renowned for his extraordinary escape to freedom and his subsequent advocacy for abolition. And Robert Branch will portray Bishop Richard Allen, who rose from the bonds of slavery to become a Methodist preacher, a fervent proponent of racial equality, and a founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the most significant African American denominations in the United States. These portrayals have been meticulously prepared by Historic Philadelphia to ensure you feel as if you're hearing directly from Henry Box Brown and Richard Allen themselves. These reenactments take you back in time, underscoring the value of preserving and learning from our past. Now, Keith Henley is stepping into the role of Henry Box Brown. Enjoy your journey through time.
Well, my name is Henry Brown. I was actually a slave born in Louisa County, Virginia. The year was 1815 on a Barrett plantation. And my family, my mother, father, my brother, and my sister, we were house slaves. And as house slaves, we were treated well. We were well-dressed, well-fed, and believe it or not, we were able to read and write. And my brother and I had access to travel anywhere in the county without any problems. Now, my Master Barrett had always promised my family that when he died, that he was going to grant us our freedom. Not that we wanted him to die anytime soon, but the mere fact that when that day ever happened, we were actually going to get free. When I was about 14 years old, Master Barrett actually became deathly ill. And just prior to his demise, he actually called my parents into his room to inform them that he actually changed his mind. Instead of giving us our freedom, he decided that he was going to separate the family amongst his children. My mother, my sister, and I went to live with his eldest son, William, in Richmond. Now, prior to his death, he actually called me into his room to inform me that as long as I was obedient, that no one would ever abuse me, that I would never get physically abused. And that was one of the joys of our lives. My family, none of us have ever been physically abused. Well, Master Barrett had passed on and we ended up in Richmond, Virginia. Now, while I was in Richmond, Virginia, I learned a new trade. I was started to make cigars and cigarettes and things of that on the tobacco plantation. Well, when I was about 15 years old, I decided that it was time for me to settle down and have a family of my own. So one day I'm walking through town and it just so happens on the other side of the road, I saw the most beautiful creature I had ever seen in my life. Well, I made eye contact with her and she made eye contact with me. And believe it or not, she was just as fascinated with me as I was with her. So I decided to go and meet her. Well, the minute I decided to do that, you know what she did? She ran into the general store. So I thought, I was saying to myself, how did You think that's going to keep me away from you? Well, I went inside the store and I chased her around the store. Oh, it was so much fun. We had such a wonderful time. And when it was time for her to leave the store, I asked her if it would be all right if I could walk her home. And she allowed me to walk her home, and we held hands, and it was puppy love. It was just so cute. Now, I knew then that once I got her back to her home, on my way home, I knew that she was the one. So in our day, slaves, in order for them to get married, they had to get permission from their masters. So I go to my master and I ask Master William if it would be all right for me to marry the young lady. Oh, by the way, her name is Nancy. Oh, what a beautiful woman. She was such a beautiful woman. Oh, I wish I could show up. Just absolutely breathtaking. Well, after I learned to my master said it was all right. I went to her master, Master Lee, and I asked him if it was all right for Nancy and I to get married. Well, he responded to me that as long as my master would not sell me, it would be all right, because he was a Christian gentleman and he did not believe in the separation of family. Well, all was well. My wife and Nancy and I got married, and everything was going well for us for 1 year. Yes, it only took 1 year before Master Lee decided to sell my Nancy. Believe it or not, Nancy was bought and sold 3 more times. Well, now we have a gentleman by the name of Cottrell. Now, Master Cottrell wanted to purchase my Nancy for his wife. Believe it, my wife was being sold for $350. Now, Cottrell didn't have $350. He only had $300. So he came to me and he says, Henry, you give me the $50 I need in order to purchase your wife, and I promise that I will never sell the wife or the children. And then he says, I have an even better idea. If you give me the money that I need, and if you are able to provide room and board for the wife and the children, I will allow your wife to remain with you and the children. And all you have to do is pay me $50 a year. And anytime I want to hire your wife out for work, if you're able to pay for the hire, she could remain in the home with you. Well, I thought it was kind of odd that a white man would come to a slave and asking him for money. But I prayed about it, and believe it or not, give him the money. And for the next 10 years, I was able to provide room and board for my wife and the children. Well, everything, like I said, was going so well for us. But what I did not understand was, or did not know, was that Cottrell was catching so much help from the other slave owners in the area that one day he comes into my home and he demanded a large sum of money, of which he knew I did not have. And because I did not have it, therefore I was in breach of contract. So when I was gone and worked for about a few hours, I received word that he had gone into my home, removed the wife and the children, and he sold them to another Christian gentleman, a Methodist minister from North Carolina. Well, I tried very hard to retrieve the money I needed in order to keep my family, and I could not do that. So now I'm alone. So for the next 3 months, I was so distraught that I was praying and praying and praying, asking God for, how am I going to overcome this? What am I going to do? And believe it or not, one day I was reading the Bible. I was reading about Moses and what was going on with him. And that's when the Lord gave me the idea of mailing myself. Yes, I decided that I was going to mail myself. Now, the idea was, where am I going to mail myself? Well, it just so happens that a very good friend of mine who owned the general store, he knew of the Vigilance Society in Philadelphia, the office of William Steele. And so we wrote a letter, tell them what my intentions were, and see if they would be interested in receiving the box. Well, they returned the letter saying that they would. Well, at that moment, I had to get things in motion. So I designed the box, and I had to figure out a way of getting out of work so that no one knew what I was doing. So I got a hold of some petrol oil, and I tried to pour just a little bit on my hand. And I was so excited that I actually put too much and ended up burning a hole in my hand. Well, I go to the overseer, and he released me and said I wouldn't have to go to work. I had the day off. Well, when I had that day off, that's when they planned my escape. When I end up in the box, I spent 27 hours in the box. And the whole time I was there, crying and praying, because I was praying for the health and the welfare of my family. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that I was also being taken care of in the box. I was praying that the Lord would guide me. And while I was in the box, I put music to one of my favorite Psalms, and it was Psalm 40. And I'm not going to sing it, and I'm not going to tell the whole Psalm, but there was a part in there that reminds me of how good God is. And it says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he heard my cry. Blessed is the man who puts their trust in the Lord. Well, when I arrived in Philadelphia, Mr. Steele comes to, the box is actually delivered to Philadelphia. I believe the address is 5th and Arch Street. And when I get to his office, he raps on the box and he says, all is well. And I return the rap and I said, all is well. They release the lid and I jump out of the box and I say, how do you do? And I begin to sing the song that I had constructed inside the box. Well, from that point on, I stayed in Philadelphia for a short period of time, and I was asked to go to Boston to tell my story because everybody wanted to hear how I was able to nail myself in a box. There I am in Boston, and I made my money by I became a magician using the box. And because I was a good singer, I sang a lot, and I was able to raise the money that I needed in order for me to travel and to do things that I wanted to do. Unfortunately, in the year the time that I actually did the escape was in March of 1849. And the following year, in 1850, a very horrific thing took place. Congress changed the laws. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was ratified, which opened the door for slave catchers to go as far as the Canadian border to retrieve runaways. Well, everyone had heard about my escapade, and there were posters about me all over the place that I knew that it was unsafe for me to remain in the United States. So right then, I was able to get me a ticket, and I ended up in England. And there I stayed for the remainder. Well, I'm not going to say I stayed for the remainder of my days. I stayed there until after the Civil War had ended. And at that moment, that's when I decided to come back to the United States with my new family. And I didn't like what I saw here. And so I took my family and I settled in Toronto, Canada, where we lived until until we enjoyed one another's company. But that is pretty much my story. If you get a chance, I have a book that I wrote when I was in England. It is called The Narrative of Henry Box Brown. It gives you so much more detail about my life and what it was like to be a slave, but most importantly, what it was like to be a free man. And that is what I am, a free man. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to Keith Henley for his portrayal of Henry Box Brown. And next, we have Robert Branch as Bishop Richard Allen.
Greetings. My name is Bishop Richard Allen, and I am the founder of the first independent African church denomination in America. They call them AME churches, African Methodist Episcopal, founded in Philadelphia to give Africans a better place where they could go and worship in peace and with some dignity. Now, I was born enslaved in the year 1760. I was owned by a rather prominent lawyer here by the name of Benjamin Chew, who at one point would serve as Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Well, since in the eyes of the law, my parents, older brother and sister, and I, well, we're just property, he just decided to sell my whole family to a plantation owner in Delaware when I was 7 years old. Now, this new owner, he wasn't a cruel man. He considered himself to be a father, and we were his children. But regardless, by the time I'm a teenager, I'm a very depressed and sometimes angry young man because I realize that I'm nothing more than another poor, wretched, undone Negro. And I'm going to have to work from sunup till sundown while somebody else got the benefits. I'd have to take that bitter pill of enslavement each and every day. But it was right around that time some Methodist preachers came to the area. And they started a church and a church school for enslaved Africans. Now, my owner, he wasn't really even a believer, but he allowed me to attend. And when I listened to the preaching, I started to understand my biggest problem wasn't that I was enslaved to people. My biggest problem was I was enslaved to sin, breaking God's laws. And that one day, we all had to stand in front of this judgment seat of Christ and be judged for what we did. And we'd be in danger of eternal hellfire judgment. Well, it wasn't just because of what would happen in the hereafter that attracted me to be a believer. It was what would happen in this life, in this world. Because they told me that I needed to seek the kingdom of God that was coming to this earth, and I needed to seek a right way of living for God. And then if I did that, everything that I needed for life would be added to me. So one night, I just fell on my knees and I cried out to him with all my heart. And immediately I became a different person. I was no longer depressed. I was no longer angry. In fact, I started holding prayer meetings in my owner's kitchen. And he eventually joined us. And he and his family, well, they became believers as well. Well, my owner had saw that I became a totally different person. And I saw that he wanted to know more about the faith. So I encouraged him to invite a preacher to come to the plantation. And a preacher came and pointed straight at him and said, "Oh, you slave owner, you weighed in the balance and you've been found wanting." Oh, my owner was cut to the heart. He realized he needed to free me. But the problem was money. You see, he paid a lot of money for me. His business was doing very badly. And it wasn't long ago that he was forced to sell my mother and 3 siblings because he was in such desperate need of money. But he did agree to allow me to go out and work, earn money, and after I could give him $2,000, I could be free. So I found work as a woodcutter, and I remember how blistered and painful my hands would get doing that work, but I didn't mind because I knew I was working towards my freedom. And I also worked for a time as a wagon driver for the Patriot Army. I delivered salt from Rehoboth, Delaware, up to Valley Forge. And it took me 3.5 years, but I was able to buy my freedom. Now, when I was born with the name Negro Richard. Well, as a free man, I wanted a proper first and last name, like all the people had. And I remembered my first owner had a friend. His name was William Allen. William Allen, well, he also would be Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. He had been mayor of Philadelphia, and he was so wealthy, he was able to start his own city. The city was called Allentown. Well, I decided I was going to take Allen as my last name, and I became Richard Allen. And then I decided, I want to be a preacher. And boy, did I get a reputation. And they heard about me in Philadelphia. And in 1786, I accepted an invitation to join the ministry at St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. Now, when I came to Philadelphia, I realized I still need to work. to make a living. So I found work as a chimney sweep, started a chimney sweep business. I learned how to make shoes. I started a shoemaking business. I started dry goods stores. I started selling dry goods. And I started buying property in Philadelphia. I was getting a steady stream of rental income. Now, when I came to Philadelphia, I noticed there were many free Africans here that were business owners. They had jobs, and they were making a pretty good income. But I also noticed there was a large number of newly freed Africans who didn't have any education. They didn't have any skills. They didn't have any money. And some of them needed help desperately just so they could survive. So I helped to form an organization called the Free African Society, where those of us who were working, we had money, we would contribute regularly to help the disadvantaged in our community, most especially the widows and the orphans. I want to get back to talking about my experiences at St. George's Methodist Church. And I said, yes, we know that you are quite the preacher, but we really are only interested in you holding separate services for our African members at 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, when I started, there's only 5, but because I also preach on the street corners, within a year, there's almost 50 of us. And we want to go to the regular services as well. But we noticed that many of the white members became increasingly uncomfortable. And it wasn't uncommon where we had no seats in the church. We'd have to stand along the walls. And we also were made aware of the fact that there were whites-only sections in the church. We weren't even allowed to kneel down and pray there. Well, one Sunday, some of us did make that mistake to kneel down and pray. And while they were on their knees, they were told, get up. You can't kneel down and pray here. And my friend Absalom Jones, he calmly said, listen, we'll move, but just please allow us to finish our prayer. No! And violently yanked him and several others off their knees. Well, I let her walk out of that church. And the Methodist said, no, come back. You're Methodist. You need to stay under our authority. And I said, no, under no circumstances will we come back to that church. So they said, well, if you don't come back, we're not going to allow you to be Methodist anymore. And I told them, if you deny us your name, you cannot deny us a name in heaven, because we believe heaven is free for all who worship in spirit and in truth. Well, for a while we had no place to meet, but the Quakers agreed to allow us to meet at a school they had started for Africans. Oh, but everything had to be done according to their rules. And one of their rules was nobody could say anything for the first 15 minutes. You had to sit in complete silence. And then people could just sort of stand up and say whatever they wanted to say. And this was strange to me because the meetings I was familiar with, there was preaching and teaching of the Word of God. And what also I thought was strange was we were not permitted to sing. And that really was strange to me because I could read the Bible and I saw there were many stories where people came together and they sang praises to God. So I began to speak out my concerns about this. Oh, and that made the Quakers very angry. And they convinced the other Africans to do something to me, which was called read me out of meeting, which meant I was no longer welcome. But I kept contact with the Africans because I realized, it's only a matter of time. They will come to see that this is not the best style of worship for us. And I was right. And eventually we agreed that we needed to form independent African churches. And we started raising funds. And among the contributors was President George Washington. And, I also worked with my friend Absalom Jones, and we were making plans to have a nail-making facility. But then the yellow fever epidemic hit in 1793, and our plans for the factory and our plans for our church had to be put on hold because the mayor had reached out to the Free African Society and asked us for our help because there was really nobody that was in the city that was able to look after the sick and bury the dead. And we did that. But somehow we were accused of taking advantage of the situation. And Absalom Jones and I published a pamphlet to rebut this false idea. Well, in 1794, we were actually able to form 2 African churches. The first was St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church, led by my friend Absalom Jones, and the next became Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which I took the leadership of. Now, St. Thomas Church, so far as I know, never was an independent church. And it took me 22 years to get independence because I had mistakenly signed a document incorporating my church into the Methodist Church. And so they said, no, that church, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to us. And we're going to dominate and we're going to control everything that happens in that church. And we resisted. And this made them very angry. And because they could legally do so, they threw us out of our church building. And they put the church up for public auction. But remember, I told you that I was a very successful businessman. And I saved all that money. So when they had the auction for the church, I went. And I brought that church back. It cost me $10,125 of my own money. Oh, but the Methodists are not done. They decided they were going to take us to court to try and regain control of the church. And it went all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But in 1816, they ruled in our favor. And we became an independent church. But then we said, well, why should we be satisfied with just one church? This problem of racism in church is widespread all over this country. Why don't we form a denomination? And that's what we did. And I eventually became the first bishop. Well, I must tell you, I'm not sure what's going to happen in this country because I am in Philadelphia when 5 of the first 7 presidents are elected. And of course, I can't vote for any of them. And what was sad was 5 of the first 7 presidents, well, they were all slave owners. But I'm going to hold on to my faith. And I'm going to forgive as Christ told us to forgive. And I'm going to continue to pray the prayer, let your kingdom come, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you so much for listening to my story. And if you'd like to learn more about my life, I've taken the time to write an autobiography that I do encourage you to read. Again, thank you.
We hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Here at America250PA, we are striving to make 2026 epic as we educate, preserve, innovate, and celebrate everything Pennsylvania has to offer. Do you have an epic idea for a podcast story? Go to America250PA.org to submit your idea. Thanks again for joining us.
This has been the America250PA Start Here, America Did podcast, produced by Commonwealth Media Services. Stay tuned for more epic Pennsylvania stories at America250PA.org.